You ever have one of those moments where you wake up and the world feels heavier than usual? The air presses down on you, thick, almost alive, and you can't quite tell if it's fog or just the weight of everything that's gone wrong. That's exactly how I imagine stepping into Victorian Britain must have felt, a place where the streets reeked of coal smoke and horse manure, where the gas lamps flickered against peeling wallpaper, and where survival meant clutching onto strange bottles filled with promises you could barely read. Tonight, I want to take you there with me. Not as some history lesson, but as if we're actually walking those cobblestone streets together, ducking under the gas lights, the fog curling around our ankles, the smell of damp wool and tobacco clinging to our coats. The Victorians weren't just living through an industrial revolution. They were living inside a pharmacy with no instructions. And their idea of medicine? Well, let's just say you wouldn't last an afternoon without finding yourself dazed, drooling, or halfway convinced the wallpaper was whispering secrets only you could hear. Now, before we wander too far, do me a favor. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and imagine the city outside your window has been stripped of Wi-Fi, Netflix, and every bit of comfort you cling to. Because in this story, relief doesn't come from scented candles or therapy apps. It comes from little brown bottles with names like Laudanum, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and something ominously titled Invigorating Elixir. And here's where I pull you right in. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1857 London. Your head aches from the damp chill that creeps through the brick walls. The neighbor's ferret is hacking again in the alley. And down the street, the undertaker's bell tolls like it always does, dragging another poor soul into the fog. But for now, your salvation sits right on the breakfast table. Laudanum, a potion that Victorians treated the way we treat coffee. 10% opium, 90% alcohol, and 100% false optimism. They put it in their tea, their soups, even their babies' bottles. Think about that for a second. A screaming toddler slipping into silence, not because they're soothed, but because a parent just gave them a microdose of the same stuff that would floor a grown man. I remember reading about it for the first time and laughing nervously, like, no way people gave this to infants. But then I thought about how desperate parents get even today, the long nights, the endless crying, the way you'd do anything for 5 minutes of quiet. And suddenly, it didn't feel so funny. It felt familiar. Like maybe if I'd been a Victorian father, staring down another sleepless night, I'd reach for that little brown bottle too. At Ponta. So there you are, in your cramped London townhouse. The wallpaper's curling at the edges, the air smells faintly of coal smoke, and breakfast is nothing but stale bread, weak tea, and the one thing that makes all of it bearable: a few drops of laudanum. You swirl it into your cup and sip. Bitter, cherry-soaked regret slides down your throat. And then, slowly, the edges of your anxiety blur. Rent doesn't feel as urgent. The cholera outbreak feels distant, like something happening in another neighborhood. Even your screaming child softens into a peaceful bundle, his little chest rising and falling thanks to a dose you slipped into his milk. And you tell yourself it's fine, it's medicine, after all. The doctor prescribed it. He prescribes it for everything: gout, toothaches, insomnia, heartbreak, wounded pride, the mysterious female troubles, and my personal favorite, nervous complaints, which is Victorian code for, you seem unhappy, here's some opium. It was more than a drug. It was a way of life. You'd measure your errands by how long the haze lasted, knowing you wouldn't finish a single task but convincing yourself otherwise. You'd walk slower, your thoughts floating like the fog on the Thames. You'd stare at a pigeon outside your window for 3 hours straight, convinced it had a deeper purpose you were about to uncover. And when it finally wore off, you didn't call it addiction. You called it habit. Regular customer, loyal patient. Just another soul trying to survive the endless grind of coal dust and unpaid bills. And here's the thing that sticks with me. In every Victorian home, right above the fireplace, sat two objects: the family Bible and the bottle of laudanum. Equal weight, equal comfort. That alone tells you everything you need to know about the Victorian soul. half faith, half oblivion. But let's not romanticize it too much. You keep sipping that cherry-soaked blur, and soon enough, the world slips away completely. Time becomes meaningless. Hours melt into each other. Your neighbors scream at each other in the street, and you can't be bothered to care. The undertaker wheels by another cart, and it feels more like background music than tragedy. You're not alive, not really, you're floating. And that's just breakfast. Because later, when the laudanum wears thin and your nerves start twitching again, there's always the next step. The opium den ends. Imagine this. The streets are narrow, slick with fog and sewage. You duck down a flight of steps and through a battered wooden door. The air inside is thick incense, smoke, cabbage, bodies. The wallpaper is stained in colors no artist could recreate. You step carefully because the floor clings to your shoes. And then, through the haze, you see them. The regulars. Men slumped on sofas that should have been condemned decades ago. Painters sketching the same line over and over. Bankers staring off into nothing, mouths slightly open, drool glistening in the gaslight. Someone passes you a long pipe. The ritual is delicate heat, the sliver of opium. Inhale slowly and wait for the fog to swallow you whole. The taste is sharp, bitter, but within seconds, your body softens, your bones loosen, the world grows quiet. The landlord's threats, the factory's grind, the British drizzle that seeps into your soul, all of it vanishes. You don't talk much in here. Nobody does. A mumble, a sigh, the scrape of a match. That's it. It's socializing without the burden of words. Just floating together, lost in visions. Some chase hallucinations, swirling colors, phantom music, shadows that move when they shouldn't. Others just nap, their faces slack, finally finding the rest Victorian life never allowed. Right. But you never leave lighter. The proprietor, a shadow with watchful eyes, makes sure of that. Coins vanish from your pocket. Your shoes might too. You stumble out hours later, dazed, broke, and convinced you'll never return. Until you do. Tomorrow, same fog, same pipe, same slow surrender. Hey, Victorian self-care. Dream big, drool quietly, and always check your pockets. When the fog of the den finally spits you back out into the street, your lungs burn like you've been breathing through a chimney, and your pockets feel lighter than your conscience. You tell yourself never again that old lie we all whisper when our bodies ache with regret. But then the toothache starts, sharp, relentless, like tiny hammers driving into your gums, and you realize that swearing off one vice only makes room for another. So you head back to your friendly neighborhood chemist, the man with the curling mustache and the eyes that have seen it all. He greets you like an old friend, not with concern, not with judgment, but with the eager smile of a man who makes his living off misery and molars. You mumble something about a toothache, and he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't reach for pliers, doesn't mention surgery, doesn't even offer sympathy. Instead, he slides a little glass vial across the counter. Rub this on your gums, he says. Miracle stuff. You uncork it, and the scent is sharp, sweet, medicinal. The label says cocaine toothache drops. That's right. Pure, uncut confidence in a bottle, available to anyone with a few coins and sore teeth. The first dab burns cold, then hot, then nothing at all. Suddenly, you can't feel your gums, your lips, or half your face. The pain doesn't vanish so much as dissolve into numbness. You smile in the mirror and realize you can't quite tell if you're smiling at all. But here's the catch. The relief comes with a jolt, an energy that surges through you like you've just swallowed the entire Industrial Revolution. And just like that, you're not just numb, you're alive. You walk out of the chemist's shop feeling lighter on your feet, sharper in your mind. The drizzle doesn't feel as cold, the factory whistle doesn't sound as bleak, and for once you almost want to smile at your neighbor even though he's still yelling at pigeons. You could run a mile, write a poem, or paint a masterpiece. And maybe you would. if you weren't too busy talking about how you could run a mile, write a poem, or paint a masterpiece. That's the thing about cocaine. It doesn't just make you feel better, it makes you feel unstoppable. And the Victorians adored it. Dentists smeared it on gums with reverence. Surgeons used it as anesthesia. Poets swore it unlocked the doors of creativity. Even explorers swore by it, chewing lozenges laced with the stuff as they trudged through the Scottish Highlands or dreamed of summiting impossible mountains. I can almost picture it. Some frostbitten adventurer, boots full of holes, cheeks red from the wind, grinning madly as he sucks on a lozenge and declares the weather positively invigorating. Not because it is, but because he can't feel his face anymore. And it wasn't just the rough edges of society indulging in this little miracle. Even the Queen's own physicians whispered about the benefits of Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine laced with coca leaves. A royal tonic, they called it. One sip and the palace hallways seemed a little brighter, the endless duties a little less suffocating. Imagine toasting to the empire while your heart races like a telegraph line and your nerves hum with artificial courage. But it wasn't just about health. Cocaine became a mask. A cure not only for physical pain, but for shyness, awkwardness, exhaustion. Feeling anxious about speaking in public. Rub some on your gums. Nervous about dinner with your in-laws? A discreet dab and suddenly you're charming, witty, and just a little bit too enthusiastic about charades. I think about that sometimes, how much of Victorian society must have been propped up on the backs of drugs like this. The carefully rehearsed smiles at dinner parties, the sudden bursts of confidence in Parliament, the glowing testimonials in the penny papers about banished fatigue and renewed vigor. It makes you wonder how many speeches, laws, and deals were signed under the influence of a numbed tongue and a pounding heart. And yet, the Victorians never asked about side effects. Not really. Addiction was a word reserved for the poor souls who couldn't afford to hide their habits. For everyone else, it was just routine. A touch of powder here, a drop of tincture there. If your hands shook or your sleep disappeared, you didn't blame the bottle, you blamed your constitution. Or the weather. Or, my favorite excuse, female nerves. You carry that little vial with you now, slipping it into your pocket as you stride down the foggy streets, your step quicker, your eyes brighter. You feel like you could outtalk the preacher, outrun the police, outthink the very world itself. And maybe for an hour, you can. Until the crash comes, and you're left staring at the ceiling in your tiny room, twitching, sweating, whispering promises that tomorrow you'll only take a little less. But tomorrow never listens. I remember trying to picture it once, what it would have been like to walk into a Victorian parlor and see everyone buzzing, laughing, talking all at once, their gums numb and their spirits soaring. No phones, no distractions, just raw conversation, sped up like a record played too fast. And I wondered, was it brilliance or just noise? Did they actually create, or did they just convince themselves they were about to? It's strange, isn't it? We look back and laugh at the absurdity of handing out cocaine at the chemist's counter. But how different are we, really? Coffee to keep us awake, alcohol to take the edge off, pills for sleep, powders for calm. The labels changed, the names changed. But the hunger to escape, to feel better, to feel something that's still the same. And so, as you drift through the Victorian streets, numb smile on your face and a vial burning a hole in your pocket, you realize this city is held together not by stone or mortar, but by bottles. Bottles of comfort, bottles of denial, bottles of dreams. Each one a little gamble, a little miracle, a little piece of oblivion waiting to be swallowed. You stop at a corner, the fog curling around you, gas lamps flickering overhead. Somewhere, a poet is scribbling furiously under the influence of inspiration in a bottle. Somewhere, a mother is dosing her baby with Mrs. Winslow syrup so she can finally sleep. Somewhere, a man in a silk waistcoat is toasting to progress with a glass of cocaine wine, convinced the empire will last forever. And you You just stand there, tasting the numbness on your lips, wondering if this is survival or if it's just another kind of slow surrender. Night creeps in fast over London. The gas lamps flicker, the fog thickens, and the clatter of carriage wheels turns into a rhythm you can't escape. You've spent the day staggering through coal smoke, dodging horses, and swallowing enough questionable tonics to make your liver plead for mercy. Now it's midnight, and you're lying in bed, staring at a cracked ceiling that seems to press lower every hour. Sleep should come easy, but it doesn't. The city never shuts up. Someone down the street is still hawking roasted chestnuts. A drunk sings off-key. A violin drags out the same 3 notes in the flat above you, and beneath it all, the gnawing anxiety. Rent, illness, the stench of the river, the dread that tomorrow will be just like today. That's when you remember the little bottle tucked on the nightstand. The label, chloral hydrate, a sedative, a miracle, a promise written in ink and hope. I picture it vividly, a spoon glinting in the lamplight, a dark liquid poured into a glass swirling with whatever passes for cherry juice tonight. The taste is sharp, chemical, sweet in a way that feels wrong, like drinking cough syrup's ghost. But the effect? Pure surrender. Minutes later, your eyelids sag. The city's noise softens into a lull. The horses clopping over cobblestones blur into a rhythm like distant thunder. Even the accordion, that cursed instrument that always finds you, twists itself into a lullaby. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, you sink into the heavy, velvet embrace of oblivion. And here's the thing. You don't just sleep, you vanish. That's what made chloral hydrate revolutionary. Before it, sleep was a privilege. If the laudanum didn't knock you out, if gin didn't keep your nightmares at bay, you were stuck tossing and turning in a room that smelled of damp wool and regret. But now, one spoonful of this miracle, and even the worst insomniac could drift into silence. But doctors loved it. Finally, something reliable. No more messy opium dreams. No more improvising with whiskey and prayer. They prescribed it for sleeplessness, anxiety, and in their charmingly vague way, being too alive. It showed up on every bedside table, from the mansions of Mayfair to the soot-stained boarding houses by the docks. Lund, I think about that sometimes, what it must have felt like for people who lived in constant noise, constant stress, constant fear, to finally have a way to turn off. Imagine being a factory worker whose body never stops aching, or a mother listening to her children cough through the night in a damp tenement, or a clerk haunted by the fact that his entire career is one bad investment away from collapse. For them, that spoonful of chloral wasn't just medicine, it was mercy. But mercy comes with a price. The mornings after were different. You didn't wake up rested. You woke up fogged, heavy, like your brain had been wrapped in wool and forgotten by the fire. Sometimes you couldn't remember your dreams. Sometimes you weren't sure if you dreamed at all. You'd shuffle through the morning, a shadow of yourself, convinced the world had slowed to half speed. And yet, nobody cared. Because in a world where rest was rare, even groggy oblivion was a blessing. I picture myself there too, lying in some cramped little room, the wallpaper peeling, the air thick with mildew, my nerves jangling from a day spent listening to the city grind. Would I take that spoonful? Of course I would. I'd tell myself I deserved it, that one night of oblivion couldn't hurt, and the next night, when the accordion started again, I'd take another, and another, until I couldn't remember what real sleep even felt like. Everyone had their story with chloral. A friend swore by it to sleep through her husband snoring. A clerk bragged it gave him the courage to face meetings with his boss. Even the family dog, poor creature, sometimes got a dose just enough to keep him from howling at the moon and waking the neighbors. In an era where everyone was stretched thin, it felt like the cure for everything. And yet, I can't shake the darker side. And I once read about a man who dosed himself so heavily he slept straight through a fire in his building. He only survived because the neighbors dragged him out. Imagine that the world burning around you and you snoring through it, blissfully unaware. Or women who leaned too heavily on the bottle, waking in the morning so dazed they couldn't tell if the baby in the cradle had cried through the night. Doctors whispered about chloral habit, but most ignored it. Easier to believe in a miracle than to face the truth. There's something haunting about that. The idea of sleep becoming both salvation and danger. The very thing meant to save you quietly consuming you. It's the Victorian paradox, isn't it? Every cure was a poison in disguise. I think about what it must have been like to wander those streets at night. Every window glowing with lamplight. Behind each one, a family, a secret, a bottle. One home quiet because the father dosed himself into oblivion. Another silent because the mother slipped syrup into her child's milk. A third heavy with the breathing of someone drifting on chloral, halfway between life and death, just happy to finally not feel anything at all. That's the eerie beauty of Victorian medicine. It didn't fix the world. It didn't cure poverty or smog or grief. It just softened the edges, dulled the noise, made survival a little less sharp. One spoonful at a time. And as you sit there, drifting, your body heavy, your breath slow, you almost convince yourself the world outside doesn't matter. The bills, the coughs, the constant reminders of mortality, all of it fades. For tonight, at least, you're safe in the velvet dark. But tomorrow you'll wake with a tongue like lead, eyes that don't quite focus, and a hunger for another spoonful. Because sleep, once borrowed, is a debt that never stops collecting. The nights in Victorian Britain don't really end. They stretch on, damp and restless, until exhaustion itself becomes a kind of second skin. You hear it through the walls. Babies crying, children coughing, footsteps pacing creaky floors, the muffled voices of parents begging for just a little quiet. Sleep isn't a gift in this city. It's a war. And every war needs its weapon. Hey, on the mantelpiece, tucked between the family Bible and a chipped vase of dead flowers, sits a little bottle. Brown glass, carefully corked, with a label that glows faintly in the gaslight. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. A miracle in a teaspoon. A savior for every parent too tired to keep rocking the cradle. A blessing for neighbors weary of endless wailing. And the secret? Morphine. Pure, powerful, and poured straight into the mouths of children. I've thought about this often, what it must have felt like to hold that bottle in your hand after days of no sleep. The baby screaming, the toddler banging on the floorboards, the lodger in the attic threatening to leave because he hasn't had a peaceful night in weeks. You'd do anything for relief, anything for silence. And suddenly, here it is. A teaspoon, a swallow, and your entire household transforms. Aye. The ritual is almost tender. A careful measure into the spoon, the faintly sweet smell, like herbs laced with something heavier. You whisper a promise to yourself just enough to take the edge off. The child swallows, the eyelids flutter, and within minutes, the screaming dissolves into soft, rhythmic breathing. The entire house exhales with them. For the first time in days, you hear yourself think. And what do you hear? Not peace, not relief, but the faintest whisper of guilt. Because you know, even if you don't want to admit it, that you didn't soothe your child. You silenced them. You traded cries for stillness. And yet, in that moment, the temptation is too sweet to resist. Every parent on the street knows the trick. Mothers recommend it to one another with the same pride they reserve for new recipes. Doctors prescribe it as if it's a vitamin. Advertisements plaster the walls, featuring cherubic babies beaming with suspicious serenity. The posters never mention the morphine, of course. They just promise quiet. And isn't that what every Victorian parent wanted? Quiet. I imagine it vividly. A row of narrow houses, all filled with children. Some crying, some restless, some shouting in their sleep. But in the house where the syrup sits on the mantel, there's silence. thick, velvety silence. The kind of silence you could fall into and never climb back out. It makes me shiver, because I've known that kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy one. The one that feels like the air itself has gone still, like the world is holding its breath. When I picture that syrup, I think of all the rooms filled with that silence. Rooms where children lay motionless, their dreams stolen, their little chests rising and falling too slowly. But the parents believed they'd found salvation. One mother I read about swore the syrup saved her marriage. She and her husband hadn't spoken in weeks, the child's wails drowning out every attempt at conversation. One dose, and suddenly the house was calm enough for them to sit across from each other and remember they were more than exhausted ghosts. Another neighbor bragged she slipped syrup into her twins' bottles before Sunday service, finally able to sit through the sermon without red-faced apologies as the baby screamed. Of course, no one asked what happened if you gave a little too much. Nobody wanted to think about the children who didn't wake up quite as bright the next morning, or the ones who drifted deeper than they should have. The syrup promised peace, and peace was all anyone wanted. And here's the chilling part. It worked. The streets were quieter because of Mrs. Winslow, the houses calmer, the mothers more rested. A generation of Victorian children grew up in that haze, their earliest lullabies sung not by mothers, but by morphine. And the adults, exhausted and desperate, convinced themselves it was love. I can't help but see it as a mirror. How many shortcuts do we take today, not with bottles of morphine, but with screens, with distractions, with ways of silencing rather than soothing? Different bottles, same temptation. But back in that narrow London townhouse, none of that matters. You've dosed the baby. The crying has stopped. The air is still. For the first time in days, you can collapse into a chair, head in your hands, body finally loosening. You almost forget that the child's silence is borrowed, rented from a poison that doesn't forgive. You sit there in the lamplight, staring at the brown bottle. You trace the label with your fingertip. You wonder how many more nights you'll lean on it. You promise yourself only when it's really bad. Only when it's necessary. Only when you can't take another minute. And then, a week later, you're pouring another spoonful, and another, because necessity has a way of shifting its definition. The Victorians didn't think of it as addiction. They thought of it as survival. But survival, night after night built on morphine, is no survival at all. It's just surrender in smaller doses. I imagine the last thing you hear before finally dozing off is the sound of your baby's soft breathing, unnatural in its stillness. The sound of peace, the sound of danger, the sound of an entire generation being raised on the promise of quiet at any cost. And you, like every other exhausted parent in the city, tell yourself the same lie as you drift off. Tomorrow, I'll try without the syrup. But tomorrow the bottle will still be there. The syrup may quiet the babies, but the adults needed their own escape. And for that, they had ether. Now, ether was supposed to be serious. It was supposed to be medicine. A miracle for surgeons tired of sawing through limbs while patients screamed themselves hoarse. With ether, a man could lie still on the table, drifting off into a blank, painless oblivion while his leg was sawed clean off. Revolutionary. Life-saving. But here's the thing about Victorians. They never let a good drug stay in the operating theater. Soon, ether was leaking into parlors, creeping into drawing rooms, tucked away in the pockets of bored guests at evening dances. Picture this. A respectable party, chandeliers glowing, lace curtains swaying in the draft, the punch bowl warm and the dancing clumsy. The host tells the same tired story about his cousin's railway accident for the 5th time. The air is thick with politeness, boredom, and the faint smell of boiled beef. And then, someone, maybe the daring niece, maybe the eccentric uncle, pulls out a delicate bottle. A dab on a handkerchief, a conspiratorial glance, a daring inhale, And suddenly, the whole night changes. I can see it. I can almost feel it. A lace handkerchief pressed to your face, cool liquid seeping into your lungs, your knees turning soft, your head floating free. At first it burns, then it numbs, and then everything is funny. The wallpaper seems to shimmer. The flowers in the centerpiece lean toward you like gossiping friends. Your aunt's shrill laugh echoes underwater, and you swear the hostess's feathered hat is levitating a full inch above her head. You collapse, graceless but happy, onto a fainting couch. Around you, others are giggling, red-cheeked, breathless. Strangers become companions. Laughter bounces off the walls. And for a few minutes, maybe hours, the dreariness of Victorian life dissolves into pure silliness. Then, ether was a great equalizer. No class distinctions here. Bankers, poets, clergymen, all drooling together, collapsing into giggles. Their stiff collars loosened for once. Conversation became impossible. But who needed words when your brain was dancing? I imagine sitting there in the haze, looking around the parlor at all these prim and proper people, the same ones who lectured about morality in daylight, now sprawled on furniture, eyes glassy, lips damp, giggling like children. It must have been eerie, beautiful even, like watching statues crack into life for the first time. But ether was more than parlor games. It was still a marvel in surgery. Before ether, patients were strapped down, held by brute force, their screams rattling the windows while doctors hacked and stitched as fast as their shaking hands allowed. I've read accounts that chilled me men so drunk on gin they didn't even know they'd survived until the next morning. Women fainting mid-scream. Children silenced only by exhaustion. Then came ether. A handkerchief. A few deep breaths. And suddenly, silence. Not death, though sometimes it was close enough, but silence. Surgeons wept with gratitude. Patients woke with missing limbs, but no memory of the saw. For the first time, medicine didn't feel like torture. But the Victorians, restless creatures that they were, blurred the line. Surgery and soirees, healing and hedonism. One moment ether was helping a soldier survive an amputation. The next it was turning a dinner party into a circus. And oh, the stories. A girl fainting into the shrubbery, her hoop skirt tangled in roses. A young man confessing his love to the family spaniel. A guest waltzing earnestly with the grandfather clock until both toppled. These weren't rumors. They were traditions. You can almost hear the neighbors whispering the next morning. Did you hear? The Thompsons were at it again with the ether. Whole house smelled like a gas lamp by midnight. And secretly, the neighbors were jealous. But the come-down was never kind. You'd wake sprawled across the carpet, hat crooked, mouth dry, with no memory except the ache in your ribs from too much laughter. Some swore off ether after the first dizzy plunge. But most came back. Because the truth is, in a world that demanded stiff backs and stiffer morals, a little chemical silliness was irresistible. And here's the part that sticks with me. Ether was dangerous, yes. People fainted, people burned themselves with careless matches, people overdosed. But for a brief, hazy moment, it offered joy. And joy was rare in Victorian Britain. I imagined myself there, in that smoke-filled parlor, handkerchief pressed to my face. The room spinning, laughter echoing, everything absurd and wonderful. Would I have joined? Honestly, yes, because how often did Victorians get to feel weightless? How often did they get to forget the coal smoke, the coughs, the unpaid rent, the endless funerals? And isn't that what all of this was about? Every bottle, every vial, every potion, not cures, not solutions, but small reprieves. A few hours to feel like the world wasn't pressing down. And so you hand back the handkerchief, wipe your eyes, and look around at your fellow revelers. Their cheeks are flushed, their hair mussed, their stiff propriety melted into giggles. The chandelier sways, the walls blur. Someone starts humming, off-key but sweet. And for a fleeting moment, the world feels light. Uh, you'll regret it in the morning, of course. Your head will pound, your stomach will churn, and you'll swear never again. But in the fog of tonight, with ether in your lungs and laughter in your ears, you'll believe you found something rare, something precious. Not medicine, not a cure, but joy. Ether may have given the Victorians laughter, but laughter doesn't keep the cold out. Laughter doesn't numb the ache of unpaid rent or soften the sound of your children coughing in the night. For that, you needed something harder, something sharper, something that burned going down and promised, even if it lied, that tomorrow wouldn't be worse. That something was gin, and they called it Mother's Ruin, a drink so cheap, so common, and so devastating that it became both salvation and curse. By the time night fell in London, whole streets smelled of it. Little shops tucked into alleys, low ceilings stained with smoke, doors swinging open to men and women who'd had enough of this century. I can see it. A damp evening, the fog curling low, your boots soaked through from puddles you don't want to think about. You've spent the day on the edge of collapse, wages too thin, debts piling up, neighbors shouting, children crying. And then you see it. A crooked sign swinging above a doorway, the faint glow spilling out, the murmur of voices promising you won't be alone in your misery. You push open the door. The air hits you first warm, pungent, heavy with sweat and juniper. The light is dim. Shadows flicker against walls lined with cracked wood and peeling posters. Every table is crowded. Men hunched over mugs. Women slumped against walls. An old woman quietly humming a hymn as she lines up empty glasses in perfect rows. The bartender doesn't ask questions. He doesn't need to. He just sloshes gin into a chipped cup and pushes it toward you. You raise it, your hands shaking, and drink. It burns, harsh, raw, like swallowing fire doused in pine. Your eyes water, your chest heaves, and then a warmth spreads. The kind of warmth that lies. It doesn't fix anything, doesn't change the hunger in your stomach or the damp in your boots, but it dulls it. It softens the sharp edges of the world. And in that moment, that's enough. Around you, conversations loosen. A banker sobs into his sleeve, morning investments gone bad. Two chimney sweeps arm wrestle for the last bite of pie. A shoemaker brags that he once cobbled boots for the prime minister, though conveniently he can't remember which one. Laughter erupts at the far end of the bar, though no one seems to know what the joke is. And you feel lighter. I think about this often, how gin wasn't just a drink. It was a mirror. It showed people what they couldn't say sober. The anger, the grief, the despair. And sometimes, the joy buried so deep, it only clawed its way out after a few mugs. It was therapy in a chipped glass. A priest that didn't judge. A companion that never left your side until it did. The government tried to stop it. Pamphlets warning of the dangers. Campaigns about morality. But people didn't care. They'd already lost too much to listen to lectures. Gin was cheap, quick, and certain. Why settle for sermons when you could forget instead? But forgetting has its cost. The morning after, you wake sprawled on a cot or the floor, if you're unlucky. Your head feels like a forge. Your mouth is sandpaper. There's a dog you don't recognize curled at your feet. A note scrawled on your hand that reads, "Never trust a man with two umbrellas." You can't remember writing it. You can't remember much at all, except the burning in your throat and the promise you whispered to yourself, "Never again." And by noon, you're back at the gin shop, because never again only lasts until the pain comes back. That cycle, drink, regret, vow, repeat, wasn't just common. It was culture. Mothers drank it to steady their nerves, fathers to forget their failures. Children didn't drink it, but they knew its smell. sharp and herbal, like regret bottled and sold by the pint. Families crumbled around it, and still, the glasses kept pouring. I imagine the bartender's face, not cruel, not kind, just resigned. He's seen it all. The sobbing, the shouting, the laughter that turns into fights. He knows tomorrow the same faces will stumble back, coins clutched tight, hope clutched tighter. He doesn't believe in salvation. He believes in pouring. And yet, there's honesty in gin. And no umbrellas, no masks, no polite facades, just raw humanity spilling out in slurred words and tear-streaked cheeks. For all its ruin, gin gave people something rare, the chance to be unguarded. To admit, even if only to themselves, that life was hard, unbearable, sometimes impossible. I think I would have walked into one of those shops too. Maybe out of desperation. Maybe out of curiosity. Maybe just to see if the stories were true, if a sip of fire could make the world a little less sharp. I imagined myself sitting at the end of the bar, watching the faces blur in the haze, feeling the warmth spread as the night grew long. Would I regret it in the morning? Absolutely. But in that moment, maybe it would have felt worth it. Because that's the truth about Victorian Britain. Everyone was medicating. Some with laudanum, some with ether, some with gin. Different bottles, same need, the need to forget. And so you raise another glass. The laughter swells. The fog outside presses against the windows. And for one fleeting night, you believe the lie gin tells you that tomorrow might not be worse. If gin was the poor man's comfort, patent medicines were the middle-class miracle. Or at least, that's what the labels promised. Picture it. You're walking down the high street, boots clacking on cobblestones, purse clutched tight, your body aching in the way only Victorian bodies seem to. Your stomach churns from too much cabbage, your head pounds from the factory whistle, and your nerves feel as frayed as your coat. What do? You don't see a doctor. Doctors cost money, and half the time they're guessing anyway. No, you head straight for the chemist's shop. The moment you step inside, the air changes. It's heavy with camphor, licorice, and the faint tang of burned hair. Rows of glass bottles glitter under the gaslight reds, blues, greens, each one catching your eye like a carnival prize. Labels shout promises, restores vital energy, invigorates the liver, brightens the spirit. Each claim more outrageous than the last. You pick one up Dr. Bicknell's invincible elixir. The label insists it will cure headaches, melancholy, indigestion, gout, heartbreak, and possibly bad handwriting. Ingredients? A proprietary blend of botanicals, with just enough Latin to sound convincing. And hidden beneath the elegant script, the true recipe: sugar syrup, questionable herbs, and enough alcohol to qualify as a night out. But you don't know that. You don't want to know that. What you know is that you're tired, aching, and desperate for relief. So you buy the bottle, tucking it into your coat like treasure. That night, in the flickering light of a single gas lamp, you pour a spoonful. It burns, sweet and bitter all at once, like licorice soaked in regret. 10 minutes later, your stomach feels lighter, your mood lifts, and for a fleeting moment, you believe. You believe you're cured. And that belief, more than the tonic itself, is what kept Victorians going. Patent medicines were less medicine and more theater. Traveling salesmen hawked them from wagons, their voices booming, their hands waving like magicians. Posters plastered walls, showing rosy-cheeked children and radiant mothers, all supposedly transformed by a spoonful a day. Newspapers carried glowing testimonials. A gentleman in Leeds swore Dr. Wormwood's cordial cured his gout, sciatica, and hatred of Mondays. A widow in Bristol claimed her spirits had lifted so high she could dance again, though nobody asked her neighbors if they agreed. And people bought it, because hope, bottled and labeled, was worth a few coins. I think about that sometimes, how it feels when you've tried everything and nothing works. But then someone offers you a miracle. even if deep down you know it's a trick. A part of you wants to believe. I know I would've. Desperation makes believers of us all. But the side effects. Oh, the side effects. Some bottles were laced with opiates. Relief, yes, but also dreams so heavy you couldn't wake. Others contained mercury, arsenic, or chloroform in medicinal doses. A sip might calm your nerves, or it might send you sprinting to the chamber pot, cursing the day you trusted Dr. Periwinkle's joyful juice. And then there was the rash, always the rash, mysterious, itchy, and in places you didn't want to discuss. Still nobody stopped buying, because if the first bottle didn't work, maybe the second one would, and if not, there was always a third. By the end of the month, your shelf was lined with glass trophies, a rainbow of remedies, none of which had cured you, but all of which had kept you going. Patent medicines weren't just cures. They were conversation starters. Guests at dinner parties compared bottles the way we compare apps. I tried Dr. Farnsworth's Nerve Restorer, works wonders. Oh, but have you tried Reverend Splendid's drops? Positively miraculous for bunions. Each bottle came with its own story, its own promise, its own little piece of theater. And beneath it all was the secret ingredient: hope. Because even if the tonic did nothing, even if it made you sicker, the very act of swallowing it gave you the illusion that tomorrow might be better. That's what you really paid for. Not medicine, not healing, but hope. I imagine myself standing in that chemist's shop, holding a glowing bottle, the glass cold in my hand. The chemist smiles, his mustache twitching, his eyes saying, "Go on. Everyone else does. I wouldn't resist. I'd hand over my coins, tuck the bottle close, and walk out into the fog, believing for a moment that I'd found my cure. And maybe I had not for my illness, but for my despair. That's the eerie beauty of Victorian medicine. It wasn't about science. It was about survival. One spoonful at a time. The chemist's shelves weren't just lined with cures for pain or nerves. They also whispered to vanity. Because in Victorian Britain, beauty wasn't a luxury. It was proof. Proof you weren't out in the fields working. Proof you belonged indoors with books and candlelight. Proof you were refined enough to look half dead and call it fashionable. And nothing screamed refinement quite like pale porcelain skin. Tans were for farmers, ruddy cheeks were for children, but ghostly whiteness, that was status. It meant you were untouchable, untarnished, a creature of lace and whispers. And the fastest way to get there? Tiny, delicate, glittering wafers of arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The very same poison that could end your life in a teacup, sold now in charming little packets as a beauty aid. I can see it. A young woman seated at her dressing table, candlelight flickering across her face. In front of her, a small, decorative box. Inside, what looks like a communion wafers, thin, pale, almost innocent. But these weren't prayers. These were poison, marketed as miracles. She picks one up, hesitates, then presses it to her lips. It melts on her tongue, chalky, faintly metallic, the taste of danger disguised as progress. She waits. She stares at her reflection in the mirror. Hours later, she swears her complexion looks clearer, her cheeks paler. She smiles. Victory. And tomorrow, she'll take another. Doctors, or at least the ones with fewer scruples, encouraged it. A strict routine, they said. One wafer before breakfast, another at tea, perhaps a third before bed if you're especially ambitious. And so the habit grew, wafer by wafer, until the beauty regime became less a routine and more a gamble with your own mortality. I can't help but imagine how tense those moments must have felt. Each wafer a little coin flip with fate. Would this one make your skin glow or your hands tremble? Would you look radiant at the ball tonight? Or would you faint halfway through the second waltz, collapsing into your suitor's arms with a complexion so ghostly it might never recover? And yet society applauded it. At the ball, whispers floated. Look at her glow. So pale, so delicate. Nobody asked why her fingertips tingled. Nobody questioned why she'd been dizzy all week. It didn't matter. Beauty demanded sacrifice, and the Victorians were all too willing to pay in poison. I think about Mabel, not one woman in particular, but the type every neighborhood seemed to have. The friend who took it too far. The one who followed every beauty fad with religious devotion. Lead powders for freckles. Belladonna drops for wide, glistening eyes. And now arsenic wafers. She glowed, yes. But she also trembled, her lips pale, her afternoons spent lying in a darkened room, her family whispering excuses about the vapors. Everyone knew. Nobody said a word. Because wasn't it better to faint in fashion than to live in color? The irony is thick. To look alive, women poisoned themselves. To look pure, they swallowed corruption. To be admired, they risked dying admired. I imagine myself walking into that ballroom, gaslight glowing, dresses swishing, violins singing, faces pale as porcelain, powdered to perfection, lips barely curved into smiles. And beneath the powder, trembling hands, numb fingertips, skin tinged faintly green, an entire crowd of ghosts still pretending to live. And it wasn't just arsenic. The routine extended. A dab of mercury cream for freckles, a dusting of lead powder for that matte finish, belladonna in the eyes to make them widen, pupils blown open until the world blurred into shadows. Fashion wasn't just deadly, it was hallucinatory. I sometimes wonder if the Victorians ever noticed how surreal their lives looked. Entire streets lined with people ghostly pale, eyes wide and glassy, cheeks glowing with poison. Did they recognize the strangeness of it? Or did they simply accept it? The way we accept our own silent poisons, our creams, our surgeries, our pills, because everyone else is doing it. And yet, for all its danger, it worked. At least for a while. The pale skin drew glances. The whispers turned to admiration. At the ball, under the chandelier's glow, you were a vision. Elegant, ethereal, untouchable. But the price always came due. The trembling grew worse. The fainting spells more frequent. The undertaker, always watching from the shadows, learned to spot an arsenic devotee by the telltale hue of their skin. Pale, yes, but tinged with something unnatural. Still the wafers sold. Still, women swallowed. Still the mirror dictated everything. Because in a world where beauty could mean survival, a better marriage, a higher station, a little escape from drudgery, wasn't a wafer worth the risk? I can't judge them too harshly. I think of the lengths people go to today. Surgeries, injections, endless chemicals rubbed into the skin. We just call it progress. They called it wafers. Different bottles, same desperation. And so the young woman takes her wafer. She dabs on her lead powder. She blinks wide with belladonna drops. She descends the staircase, radiant and fragile, ready to dance through the night. Every step a triumph. Every step a risk. And when she smiles across the ballroom, nobody sees the trembling in her hands. They only see the glow. Not every bottle in Victorian Britain promised silence. Some promised visions. Some whispered of muses, of inspiration, of whole new worlds shimmering just beyond the gaslight. And at the center of that promise was absinthe emerald green, bitter as secrets and dangerous as dreams. They called it the Green Fairy, not a dainty creature with wings and wands, but something stranger, something darker, a muse that sat on your shoulder, whispering ideas you'd never dare think sober. And in every smoky bar from London to Paris, you could find someone waiting for her. I imagine the scene. A narrow bar, dimly lit, wooden beams sagging overhead. The tables are packed with poets, painters, philosophers, each one clutching their glass like it holds the key to eternity. The air smells of tobacco, sweat, and something sharper: anise, fennel, wormwood, herbs steeped in legend. The ritual is half the magic. The bartender sets a glass in front of you, tall, heavy, filled with liquid so green it glows like bottled northern lights. He balances a silver spoon across the rim, places a sugar cube on top, then trickles ice water over it. Slowly, the cube dissolves, the emerald clouds, turning milky, swirling like smoke in a bottle. Around you, voices hush. Everyone watches as the transformation unfolds, as if beauty itself has just been distilled. You lift the glass. The first sip bites bitter, sharp, haunting. A taste of herbs and earth, like drinking from a haunted forest. But then warmth spreads. Your body relaxes. Your mind loosens. And that's when she comes. The green fairy. Not literally, of course. Not wings and bells. More like a presence. A thought that isn't quite your own. You look at your napkin and suddenly see patterns you swear weren't there. You stare at the candle flame, and it flickers in colors you can't describe. Your mind fills with ideas, poems, paintings, philosophies. Brilliant. Nonsense, both. The poet at the next table scribbles furiously on a scrap of paper. He swears he's captured the essence of time in 4 lines. The artist beside him sketches circles, convinced he's discovered a new geometry. A man in the corner recites Ode to a Greengrocer for the 3rd time this week, his eyes shining with drunken devotion. And nobody laughs. They listen, nodding solemnly, because in this haze, every word feels profound. I imagine sitting there, glass in hand, watching it unfold. The room buzzing with visions, delusions, inspiration, and despair. Would I have joined them? Would I have believed the fairy's whispers? I think I would have, because who wouldn't want to believe that a drink could open doors no one else could see? Absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was rebellion. It was a way of rejecting the gray grind of Victorian life, the soot, the debt, the endless rules. With every sip you told the world, I won't be bound. I won't be ordinary. I'll see beyond. Of course, the fairy's gifts came at a price. Too many glasses, and visions turned to terrors. Colors blurred into shadows. Whispers became screams. Some swore they saw demons in the corners, others that they spoke to ghosts. Doctors warned of madness, of hallucinations, of brains fried like eggs on a summer street. Moralists spread pamphlets claiming absinthe drove men to violence, women to ruin, whole nations to collapse. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The reputation stuck. But that only made it more tempting. I think about those late nights the painter hunched over his canvas, brush flying, convinced he's glimpsed the divine. The poet scrawling words that feel immortal under the fairy's touch. The ordinary clerk, drunk on visions, believing for one night he's more than just a cog in the machine. And then the mornings. Waking with eyes red, hands trembling, nothing on the page but nonsense. Canvases smeared, dreams shattered. And yet, the next night, they'd come back. Because the fairy had whispered once, and that was enough to make them chase her forever. And maybe that's the saddest part, not the poison, not the madness, but the longing. The desperate belief that inspiration could be bottled. That art, love, truth could be poured into a glass and swallowed whole. I imagine stumbling out of that bar, head spinning, shoes scuffing against cobblestones. The night air cold, sharp, filled with smoke and horse dung. The world feels unreal, the shadows alive, the moon brighter than it has any right to be. You laugh, or maybe you cry, or maybe both. The green fairy lingers in your veins, whispering that you've touched something eternal, even if you can't remember what. And the truth is, maybe you have. Maybe the fairy was nothing but wormwood and alcohol. Or maybe, just maybe, she really was there hidden in the gaslight, in the smoke, in the green shimmer of the glass. Either way, the poets kept writing. The painters kept painting. The dreamers kept drinking. And the fairy kept whispering, leading them deeper into her forest. Would I have followed her? I don't know. Part of me wants to believe I'd resist, that I'd recognize the illusion. But another part wants to see, wants to feel what they felt, wants to hear the fairy whisper just once. Because that's the pull of absinthe. It wasn't about forgetting, like gin. It wasn't about silence, like laudanum. It was about seeing, believing, dreaming. And even if those dreams rotted into nightmares for a few glowing hours, they were worth everything. And so the green fairy danced her way through the century, lighting candles in smoky bars, painting visions on the backs of eyelids, whispering secrets no one could prove were real. Some chased her into brilliance, others into madness, most into both. But all of them raised their glass, swallowed the emerald light, and believed.